Hello everyone.
Hello.
I'm Ines Smyth, Senior Gender Advisor.
And I'm Thalia, Senior Advisor on Women's Livelihoods. And the purpose of this video is to increase staff understanding about gender justice in general and gender justice in livelihoods. We'll start about the basics, about what we mean by gender justice and various terms, and then we'll talk about how livelihoods programming in particular can help to deliver gender justice. And in the new AIM-1 strategy, we affirm that gender inequality is one of the greatest barriers to poverty eradication and sustainable development. That the unequal power relationships between women and men continue to shape livelihoods and development, so all our work must promote policy and practices that challenge and redress and don't perpetuate these unequal power relations.
So let's start from women's rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that all human beings share the same equal rights, and that they are the foundation of freedom, justice and peace. Clearly, women's rights are human rights. Achieving gender justice is thus a matter of basic rights and also a means to address poverty much more effectively. Gender justice is about women's rights in society and in politics and in the economy, a kind of pie that requires us all to work together across all the dimensions.
Women's experience is influenced by many parts of their identity and not only by gender, and men's experience as well. So not all women are the same. And our programs need to think about many inequalities and design what we do to address different women in different ways.
So programs that benefit some women might not benefit others. And because these others face other forms of exclusion because of their ethnicity or disability or illness or age, we have to consider this.
Now we're going to talk about terms. Why are there all these different ways of describing the same thing? It is quite confusing.
Indeed. In our discussions, we use all the words: women's rights, women's empowerment, gender equality, gender inequality. One is certainly not better or worse than the other. They simply exist. They are all useful. But each of them has a slightly or large different focus.
So gender equality means equal rights. The right to go to school, to inherit and own land. It means that girls, for example, have the equal right to go to school as boys do. Gender
Equity, on the other hand, acknowledges that men and women experience poverty very differently. So what we do, or what governments or others do, will have to reflect that and not do the same for men and women.
So one example of this is that women's reproductive rights mean that women need different kinds of health care than men do.
Exactly.
Women's empowerment focuses on women. It's about the process of working with women individually and women in groups to realize their rights. Women's empowerment means that women will have increased power to think and act freely and realize their potential as full and equal members of society.
When we emphasize and when we say we work on women's rights in laws and policy, this is also about challenging duty bearers to be responsible for women to enjoy their rights.
So we can use all these terms, but each one has a slightly different meaning.
Indeed.
So, what does or what would gender equality look like? We do see a lot of progress in developing as well as in developed countries. In some places, in some aspects of women's lives, we do see gender equality. For example, sub-Saharan Africa is close to achieving gender parity in primary school enrollment. And universal primary education will be achieved in 2015 if the current progress continues. Lesotho has no gender gap in both education and health. And Mozambique has seen quite an increase in female enrollment in primary school and in secondary schools.
And if we look at another area of life, that of health, we can see also some improvements and progress towards gender equality, although perhaps not as much as for the case of education. Just to give some example, data from the World Health Organization show that the difference between male and female life expectancy worldwide continues to narrow. Maternal deaths are down from over 500,000 women per year to about 340,000 in the last couple of years. More women seem to have their reproductive rights now because the total fertility rate has gone down by about half in the last 60 years. Perhaps more importantly in this case, in some African countries, the maternal mortality rate has gone down consistently over the last 15 years.
Now let's look at representation. There are increases around the world on women parliamentarians. We're up 7% since 1995. And Rwanda and South Africa are leading the world with 56% and 45% women parliamentarians. In business, there are countries with quite high percentages of company directors like Philippines and Thailand. In general, we see the gender equality in some dimensions in different areas of the world. There are a few developed countries that also give us a vision of what it means to have gender equality and women's rights in many aspects of life, particularly the 4 Nordic countries, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, and Norway.
Let's look at something slightly different. For example, the statistics for Mali, where the women's health in terms of survival rates, things have improved considerably. On the other hand, violence is still remaining unaddressed from a perspective of the law, and women are still earning 66% of what men earn. So what's the message here? The message is that we have to consider progress in a much more holistic way, that our ambition for justice, gender justice, must be in all spheres and for all women. We cannot just think of our own area of work, because if we do that, women will be held back by the lack of progress in other areas. So, if we continue along this line, the aim is for all individuals and for groups of women to be empowered in all spheres of lives, and also for women to have rights in law, in policies, in practices, and this means both empowerment and rights. Now let's look at something perhaps more personal. What would real gender equality look like if the pie reflected equality in all its components, in all its spheres?
And what would women's lives be like if we'd made progress in gender equality in many different spheres? For a moment, we want you to imagine a young woman in a poor community in a developing country where progress has been made in many areas. So this is the story of Mariana. Mariana gets as much food to eat as her brothers, and she has time to study and play and participate in life because her village has systems to collect water and fuel. Her mother is not overloaded with domestic work, And her parents do not overload her with work because her brother or brothers are also doing some of the domestic work in the household. And in the community, her brother is not pressured into violent behavior or into being in a gang. So there is gender equality at home.
And this equality is reflected within the school. Both Mariana and her brother go to secondary schools. Remember that where there have been improvements in primary school, this is not being reflected in secondary school. So both her and her brother are in secondary school. If Mariana is harassed or abused in any way, she can raise her voice and the person responsible is sanctioned. Both Mariana and her brother learn a number of subjects, and those include adaptation in agriculture, health and finances, so practical knowledge as well as theoretical knowledge.
Mariana is also a part of a group of girls who lead a young voters group, and they're active in political participation at the municipal level and also up into the provincial and influencing the state level as well. The Young Voters Group with Mariana is claiming the right to ballots in their local language so that more of the older generation will be participating, especially more women.
And as Mariana grows up, she's able to finish her education as much as her brother. She chooses to train as a veterinary assistant and works in a community promoting special courses for women agricultural extensionists to develop their skill and increase their income. She is also a member of a microfinance group and uses her savings and a loan to invest in more medicine to treat animals as well as in other expenses and facilities for herself and her family.
Mariana has gender equality in her relationships and her family relationships as well. She's able to plan her family, and her house and her land are both in her name and that of her husband. She's able to negotiate with her husband about her mobility and make trips to the city when she needs to do so. Mariana has been involved in preparedness planning for disasters such as droughts, and if this happens, she and her husband will have equal control over resources and equal responsibility for decision-making in the case of disasters.
And presumably Mariana and her husband will discuss matters of sexual and reproductive life in an equal manner. So what's this story all about? It is about rights and about power. It is about equal opportunities in law, the ability and the opportunity to exercise rights, and having power as individuals and in groups.
This is a wonderful story, but it's not very common. Where women's rights are not respected and women are not empowered, life is very different for women and girls. Globally, 2/3 of all children that are not in school are girls. In North Africa, that's 66% of the children out of school that are girls. And in Ethiopia, women are half as likely as men to be literate. In developing regions, 53% of the people living with HIV in 2008 were women, and that was up from 51%, so it's getting worse. In Ethiopia, an average woman will have 5 children, and only 6% of births are attended by a skilled midwife. And domestic violence is the single biggest cause of injury and death to women worldwide.
And there is only a slightly more positive picture for what political representation is understood. Women, despite progress, still hold only 19% of parliamentary seats globally. 58 countries in the world still have only 10% or fewer women in parliament. I believe Comoros has none. In sub-Saharan Africa, on average, 28% of the parliamentarians are women. In Ethiopia, only 10% of ministerial positions are occupied by women. and many Western countries are not doing much better, including the UK.
What about work and the economy? In sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 80% of women workers are in vulnerable employment. The gendered wage gap has been very slow in narrowing. Men are still paid more than women are for similar paid jobs. But paid work is not only the only gender inequality. Women work 2/3 of the working hours. When unpaid work and caring work for people is counted, sometimes this can amount to 15 to 30 hours more work for women than men in every week. Women are responsible for collecting 64% of household water, according to a 2008 UN survey. And gender inequality in the area of work and in the area of health and representation and education is often combined with other forms of discrimination that shape women's experience, such as women who are disadvantaged also by race or ethnicity or age or physical ability or HIV status or family status, etc. So this is a very bleak picture for women in terms of their lives and in terms of their work and the economy.
And we're all familiar with the consequences for the individual women of this situation in terms of suffering, in terms of failed potential. But it is also important to stress that the consequences for these levels and types of gender inequality go well beyond those experienced by the women themselves. In fact, such consequences affect their community, countries and societies at large, and for development in brief. It is obvious that there are serious consequences for children and family when women suffer from poor health or die, for example, from maternal mortality causes. It is also true that unequal access to credit and land ownership for women is clearly related to malnutrition, given particularly the differential use that men and women in household make of income and other assets. The women who do not have land are the same women who are then unable to produce food in the abundance necessary to feed their children. So addressing gender inequality is critical for sustainable development, and we don't have a choice of not addressing gender equality if we are serious in our desire and goal to reduce and eliminate poverty.
We can also argue for gender equality in terms of the positive implications of gender equality for society and for the economy. This is true globally. That there are statistics that show that the national growth rates in East Asia and in North Africa are linked to women's equality in education and in the labor market. It's also true that of the 8.2 million fewer deaths in children between 1970 and 2009, 51% of that could be attributed to the increased education of women. This is also true, though, for our local projects. So what we're saying is that we have positive implications of gender equality for our local economic projects. That it's been shown in Burkina Faso that shifting labor and fertilizers between men's and women's plots increases outputs up to 20%. Giving women farmers the same education and inputs increases yields on those plots for more than 20%. And for smallholder coffee and banana growers in Tanzania, if you reduce the time burden for women, you can increase cash income by 20%.
So what have we been saying the last few minutes? We have been saying that there are two arguments for gender equality If we needed arguments, there are two arguments. Arguments that are for us to use, but not only those for us. Those are the arguments that we need to use to convince others as well. For example, governments or other policy and decision makers. On one hand, there is the women's rights arguments that women must enjoy the human rights as much as men. And they must also enjoy the benefits of development. The other argument is a more instrumental argument about how women's empowerment also helps and is fundamental to achieving other wider objectives, for example, that of eradicating poverty. Both arguments are important. The instrumental argument can be effective and influential in working, for example, with mixed group, with men, with officials from the private and public sector, in our work in markets and enterprise development. And we need to be better at making this argument. On the other hand, as Oxfam, we will always affirm the rights of women as human rights, given that we are a rights-based organization.
So we've talked about why work for gender justice and women's empowerment, and now we're going to talk about how. What's the approach? What's the strategy? There are many entry points for working for gender justice. Change happens in many ways, depending on the context and depending on the partners and the opportunities and power relations in each context. So there's not just one right way or one place to start. We may find entry points and strategies also in different dimensions, social or cultural, political or economic. And what's really crucial in designing our programs in general and in designing livelihoods programs is to talk together about which entry point would be best in a particular context. Why do you think it's literacy? Why is it violence? Why would you start with increasing women's income? Talk about it and debate it. What we want to do is to avoid having situations where you design a livelihoods program and then just tack on some kind of awareness raising or a women's committee without really thinking about the entry points and the logic of what we're doing. The strategies that we use for gender justice, as we've been saying, need to be complementary. So here are some examples of entry points and logic. In some contexts, Oxfams and partners believe that we must start with ending violence against women, that's the key entry point, because violence against women in these contexts is such a huge barrier for mobility, for economic activities, and for education. In other contexts, we may want to start with income. And the logic here will be that income is critical to enable women's status to change, and this is going to make a difference in terms of their decision-making power, their mobility, their education, and increased income may even diminish violence against women. We need to be explicit and clarify and debate these different change strategies. Now we're going to talk about defining strategies for women's empowerment and livelihoods. What we've found over the years is that there are 4 common errors that lead to less effective strategies in our livelihoods programs. The first one is to design a livelihoods or food security or economic development program and then add on a social component for women. This comes from a mistaken idea that the only thing holding back women in livelihoods is traditional culture. We hear this quite often when we talk to economists or private companies or governments about promoting women in livelihoods or in economic development. They may say, oh yes, it's really a bad social problem. It's a private issue, though. It's a family issue. It's not me. It's not something this project can address. And yet, what we know is that economic policy and the way that markets work and modern market policy maintain unequal roles and benefits for women and men in the economy. So how we think about the economy itself and how we think of what economic development is maintains an underinvestment, less investment in women's work and what women do, in women's crops, in women's training. It's not just a legacy of traditional society and culture, and it drags down the whole project of economic development to have economic policies that are gendered. So we need to make sure that we don't fall into the error of thinking this is a cultural issue, but really to see the gender inequality in production, in finance, and in marketing, for example. Another common error is almost the reverse, to think that livelihoods promotion is going to empower women by itself. This is a view that's too economistic, that somehow having an income or credit or a microenterprise is going to automatically solve the problems of women's rights. Programs do need to prioritize certain entry points. As we said earlier, you may say that you are going to start with income, but you need strategies that are going to be complementary. So we try to avoid writing text or proposals that imply some sort of magic about income or livelihoods or credit or enterprises, such as women were empowered by receiving training, or that a credit program led to women's empowerment. We need to address many dimensions with complementary strategies, linking up our programs that work on different aspects of women's empowerment of the pie. The third common error that we find is a fairly limited ambition for change for gender equality. We often have very good programs on an individual level or for small groups, and we have wonderful stories about demonstrating changes for these small groups or for individual women leaders. We want to increase our ambition. We want to change power relations. We need to aim for changes for individual women and changing institutions, both political and market institutions. We want to change public beliefs and public policies, and to leverage change far beyond the change that happens for our beneficiary groups. The fourth common error is to think that a good gender analysis means making a long list of all the barriers and problems that women face. So you have a livelihoods program, and then you have a long list of problems, and that's your gender analysis. Instead, what we would like is both to prioritize that list to a few issues where we can really make a difference, prioritize that list to be very specific to the particular livelihood program or food security program that you're working on, and to these women. If you are working with women who are already beyond childbearing age, child marriage is not the particular issue that you need to address in that program. If you are working with women who are producers, already members of a producer organization, you may want to work on mobility, whereas you may not need to address women's literacy for this particular group. Farther along than that, what we're saying is that a good gender analysis is about identifying opportunities for change, not problems for women. What can we change? This is what we need to be doing in our livelihoods programs. So let's look at good practices, making change happen for women's rights and women's empowerment and gender equality in livelihoods. The first good practice is the one I just said. Look for the opportunities to make change at a local level and wider change. We will be necessarily explicit about how we believe that change will happen and why we are choosing a certain entry point to work for gender justice. We're going to be looking to see what we can do for women rather than being bogged down by the long list of inequalities and barriers for women. And we will recognize that major changes take time, they're complex, and they may require strategies at many different levels with many different actors. Like the wonderful example in Malawi of working on awareness raising and rights awareness at the local level about land policies as well as the national land policy, so that widows are able to keep their land and also grow crops on their land for increasing their income. The second good practice is about working with women and men. A good gender justice and livelihoods program might be with a women's only group, but it's often with mixed groups. That doesn't mean that it's not a gender justice program. Women's rights and empowerment requires working with men about attitudes, practices, and policies about women, as well as working with women. And men also benefit from changing attitudes about men's roles. Being responsible for household security or for being the breadwinner may make men vulnerable to violence or involved in conflict. It also can lead to a crisis of masculinity in contexts or in situations where carrying out the role of being a breadwinner is impossible and there's no means of social validation. So we want both men and women to feel positive about their roles and their identity in the paid economy and in caring work and domestic work and being part of families. The third good practice on making change happen in livelihoods for gender justice is about working on many levels and working for the short term and the long term. So in some cases we may be working to get access and power in food markets on a fairly short-term scale. We're also working on the long term for education for girls and for equal division of labor in households. And we're working with producer organizations, and we're working with private sector companies and policymakers on more macro and national level economic policies to make them promote gender justice as well. The fourth good practice is about making sure that we're looking not only at practices and policies, but also about beliefs. One of the persistent issues in terms of women and livelihoods is the undervaluing of women's work in her roles in production and marketing and in her economic contributions, both in the paid cash market economy and in subsistence and unpaid family labor. So we want to change beliefs to show women's economic contribution and the value of women's work, whether it's paid or unpaid. And this leads to more investment in the technologies and in credit and in the infrastructure that will help to reduce the burden of women's work and to make women's work more effective and productive. So changing beliefs also includes making caring and unpaid work more visible and valued, and supporting and changing women's roles and men's roles in the market economy as well as in unpaid care work.
This is the time to summarize. There are a few basic things to remember. First of all is that our approach is one that needs to develop and implement complementary initiatives in the pie, in the social sphere, in the political sphere, in the economic sphere. Initiatives that cross over all of these segments of the pies, but also that embrace all the levels at which we can work. This will help us to achieve equal outcomes and progress towards the realization of women's rights. It is also important to remember that we will design and implement livelihood programs to address not only gender inequalities, but the other elements that determine the position of individuals and groups of people: age, physical and other forms of ability or disability, caste, and another aspect. We also need to remember that there are two main reasons why we work to deliver gender justice in our livelihood programs. And we have summarized this in two arguments: a justice argument, a women's rights argument, and an instrumental argument. Both are useful in order to develop the policies and practices that benefit women and to have the positive outcomes that we are aiming for. And really, finally, our objectives and all our initiatives really require transformational changes to individual and institution. And perhaps it's worth remembering at this stage that that change starts from ourselves. This can only happen if we work with both men and women at various levels, as we have said several times, using both rights and instrumental arguments to motivate everyone and work for change. And to achieve our ambition, we need commitment over time, and particularly because the kind of changes we are aspiring to are extremely fundamental and important changes. I always think, doing work for women's rights, sometimes, obviously requires some kind of knowledge, technical knowledge, but you got to feel it. You got to kind of see it and feel it. I mean, maybe it's my personal distortion, but when I walk into a room, that's the first thing I see. Where are the men and the women? How many of each? And what are they doing? How are they projecting their presence? Who's dominating? And I see that in a film, in a book, in a if I'm having lunch with friends, and so it's got to become automatic. I don't know if other people feel this way, but that's my message. You've got to live it, and live it in your own life. Otherwise, it kind of, if it becomes like a technical thing, it just doesn't work. So if I had a message, that would be the message.